Hello, ladies, gentlemen, and assorted humans. My name is William White. This is the Philosophy Club at Sacramento State in one of our fall of 2022 meetings. Those are three attributes of what we're doing. The topic for today is a faculty talk from Professor Brandon Carey of the Sacramento State's Philosophy Department. I believe the topic at hand is to do with more of an exploratory presentation on the epistemic concept of the echo chamber and how that manifests technologically speaking. Particularly, I think social media will be at the forefront of our minds here, but it'll be interesting to see how the same phenomena may manifest in other contexts if we can identify it that way. And without even defining that term for myself, I will turn it over to Professor Carey for however you want to take this.
Great, thank you, William. Nice to see everyone. Happy to be here. I'm glad you described this as an exploratory talk. That's super accurate. I'm not totally sure that I have a thesis, and I'm reasonably confident that I don't have much of an argument for it if I do. What I have is kind of a puzzle, or sort of like an enhancement to an old puzzle or something like that. And I'm probably not even going to state the puzzle in a very clear way, but I hope that with some wild gesturing, probably both literal and metaphorical, I can get you to think about a certain kind of problem that might make you worry about your epistemic situation. Because I guess that's basically what I do, is try to make people worry about their epistemic situations. So I'll say that this is part of a sort of bigger cluster of concerns I have about how to be a good epistemic agent in a hostile epistemic environment, where a lot of the information around you is information that you can't or shouldn't trust, and what sorts of decisions it would be rational for you to make in that kind of environment. And in particular, I'm resistant to a solution that people commonly propose, which is that the solution is to just get more information. Very often, if you present a certain kind of skeptical puzzle to people, they'll say, well, you could just get this kind of evidence that you don't have, and that will settle the question. And I think, for some things that's true, but I think that we face a range of epistemological problems where gathering more evidence just isn't very likely to help. And this puzzle is one of those situations, I think. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen here. I do have some slides. I don't know if they will be exceptionally useful, but they will probably help me remember to say all of the things that I'm supposed to say and define at least most of the terms that I'm supposed to define. So we will use them for that purpose. If you have questions as I'm going, feel free to do the Zoom hand raising thing. You can raise your actual hands too, but I can't have everybody on my screen at the same time, so I might not see that. Or, unmute yourself and jump in, that's fine too. But here's where we're going to start. So there's a really, really old skeptical argument from Zhuangzi, which has to do with the idea of a disagreement or like a debate between two sides about some issue. And so in thinking about that kind of thing, here's the core of the argument, I guess. So once we're in a situation like that, where you and I are arguing about something, if you win and I lose, does that show that I was really wrong? Or if I win and you lose, does that show that you were really wrong? Now, I said this was an argument, but you might notice that this is just a bunch of questions. There are no statements here. There's nothing that could serve as like a premise or a conclusion in an argument. But I take it these are supposed to be rhetorical, right? And that the answer is supposed to be no. We're supposed to think that winning a debate doesn't really mean that you were right. And that is certainly true, right? You can be persuaded by an argument, and that's not going to guarantee that you're right. That's like day one critical thinking, right? Like there's a difference between what persuades people and what is true. There's a difference between what persuades people and what ought to persuade people, like what will give you an actually justified belief, right? Like we make these distinctions all the time. So that's right. But then there's this follow-up question, which is, well, if winning the debate doesn't settle the question, how should we settle the question, right? Like if we can't figure out who's right just by arguing about it, what should we do instead? And so Zhuangzi considers, well, maybe we should tag someone else in, right? Maybe we should phone a friend, get someone else to evaluate our dispute. Maybe we like try to find some impartial judge. Maybe we try to, get some ideal reasoner. Like there are various ways you could try to sort of soup this idea up. But the concern from this series of questions is, well, look, when we pick someone, here's what's going to happen. We're going to either pick someone who's going to agree with you about these arguments, who's going to be persuaded in just the way that you were persuaded, or we're going to pick someone who's going to agree with me about these arguments, who will be persuaded in just the way I was persuaded. But that's also not going to guarantee that they're getting the right answer, right? Because we just proved that my being persuaded by my arguments doesn't show that I'm right, and you being persuaded by your arguments doesn't show that you're right. So we're just going to like be repeating the same process with a different person, but that's not going to guarantee that we're right for the same reasons that we weren't guaranteed to be right in the first place. So here at the end, we do actually get a conclusion. There's even a conclusion indicator, right? So you and I and others cannot know. So I take this to be like an argument for global skepticism, basically. I mean, I'm really bad at history of philosophy, so maybe that's completely wrong. And Jones is just like talking about this one particular thesis. I have no idea, but you can at least construct this as an argument for global skepticism, right? Like anything that two people ever disagree about, like there's just no settling it. Okay, so that's a really old argument, and that's not my argument because I think this argument is a bad argument. And the reason I think it's a bad argument is because of fallibilism, basically. I think that we can know things even if we're not guaranteed to be right. So in a situation like this, it's true that my persuading you doesn't guarantee that I'm right. Your persuading me doesn't guarantee that you're right. If we ask someone else, even a very smart someone else, they're not going to be guaranteed to be right in whatever they come to believe on the basis of the arguments and evidence that we present them with. That's all true. But you don't need that for knowledge. Or so I say. I'm not going to defend fallibilism. I'm just saying that's the case. You can know stuff without being guaranteed to be right. And I think that's a perfectly sensible way of, it's like a perfectly sensible starting point for responding to this argument. From there are different ways you can go, right? You could say, well, maybe we should ask 100 people, and if most of them agree with me, that's a pretty good reason to think that I'm right. Or maybe we should find a panel of 3 expert judges, or like whatever, right? You can give specific answers about how we should go about settling this dispute, but one way or the other, you're going to end up saying, we're going to get a reason to think that one side or the other is right. It's not going to be a conclusive reason that guarantees that they're right, but we can still get a pretty good reason. And that's good enough for us to settle the dispute, for us to know that one of us is right. Okay, so that's the old problem. And we're going to add some stuff. Well, I'm going to add some stuff to try to make that problem worse in a way that fallibilism doesn't really seem to help with. So let's add some contemporary philosophy to this. So this is Tien Nguyen. He does a bunch of social epistemology stuff, which I actually didn't know. I knew him as a philosopher of games, which is like the stuff of his that I had read. But he also does cool social epistemology stuff. And one of the things that he's interested in is studying like situations that we can be in that make us epistemically worse off. Like things about our social environment that can prevent us from knowing things, or maybe having other kinds of positive epistemic states, like having justified beliefs and that kind of thing. And one of the kinds of situations that he has written about, he calls an epistemic bubble. People write about epistemic bubbles in a lot of different disciplines and contexts. So I'm going to be a little bit careful. I'm not going to give like a super formal definition, but a little bit careful in defining this so we can contrast it with an echo chamber, which is the actual focus of our talk, my talk, I guess, the talk that you have to listen to tonight.
To jump in real quick, Justin asks in the chat,
is
philosophy of games related to game theory?
Well, it could be. There are areas of overlap, but I don't mean game theory when I talk about philosophy of games. I mean like metaphysical questions about what games are, like what counts as a game. What constitutes a game? Is it like the list of the rules? Does it include physical pieces like the board? What kinds of activities can count as games and what kinds can't? That sort of philosophy of game stuff.
Questions that start up on game night in a family filled with horrible people.
yeah, by which you mean philosophers.
Yes,
yeah, exactly. exactly. I mean, I think there's fun stuff there about like, how much can you deviate from the rules of a game and still be playing the same game and that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. Conceptual question. And
Right.
can I just because it's happening, I want to observe what's part of what's happening, just in a discursive sense. Your approach to Professor Carey, and I so appreciate it. I want to get it out the door that I think this is the right way to do it, but I just love the way you present it. Is let's see if I can make this worse. I have a problem. I haven't got a solution to it. Let's see if I can complicate this problem more. Again, that is a good way to go. That is the right way to go, especially exploratory. But it is so funny.
That is philosophy in its purest form.
Yes.
If people ask me from now on, what do you do with a philosophy degree? I will tell them, we find problems and then find ways to make the problem worse.
Yes.
I mean, I will push back only a little bit because I feel like that's also essential to doing philosophy, right? Is that you have to object to everything everyone says. I will say this, I like to come in with a positive view where I can. And I don't mean like a beat, but like a thesis, like here's what the thing is, like here's the answer to the question, now we've solved the puzzle. I'm just not there yet on this project. I am seeing an old puzzle and a kind of newer puzzle and a way for them to be related in a way that I find really worrying. And I don't have anything like a good solution, but maybe one of you will, and then that'll be great because I can steal your idea. So, yeah, exactly. So epistemic bubbles are like epistemic communities, like information sharing communities, in which you don't hear opposing views. So that doesn't necessarily mean that that's like malicious. That could happen totally accidentally. Like it could just be like a purely contingent fact that people holding a certain kind of view just aren't around you, right? It could happen in a way that's not totally accidental like that, but doesn't seem very sinister. But the important thing is just that there are views and arguments and evidence and information that you're missing out on because those voices just aren't included in your community. That's all I mean by an epistemic bubble. And there are all sorts of examples of epistemic bubbles that you encounter all the time. So as William correctly predicted, I mean, take any ordinary kind of any feed of things that you're subscribed to, right? So like if you're just looking at the people you follow on Twitter, right, like you get a running feed of their tweets, and in a way that's like curated, right? Because you decided to follow those people. You picked, from all the people that you could be following, you picked those people. And in doing that, you've probably shown a certain kind of bias. And by bias, I just mean like a tendency in one direction or another, right? So if you think about it, like I'm going to talk about politics a lot, but like if you think about it in terms of political views that you're interested in seeing on your feed, they probably have a lot in common. I mean, maybe you're one of those people who just like really likes to get mad at things that other people have said, and so you follow a few people who have views very different from yours. That does happen sometimes. But for sort of general confirmation bias reasons, we're all sort of inclined to pay more attention and involve ourselves more in information that supports points of view that we hold. And so very often you'll end up with a situation where you have not like maliciously or not like trying to self-deceive or whatever, but you sort of put yourself in a bubble by just choosing to follow the people that you're sort of on the same side with. And that can happen in all sorts of different ways.
Shalaja adds, that the traditional, philosophic epistemic bubble, fails to include female voices. And the irony of me as a man reading her comment about the lack of female voices, it's not lost on me. Shalaja, would you like to elaborate?
Oh no, I was just talking about how there's a lot more male voices, and female voices historically have been suppressed in philosophy, also because a lot of females weren't or didn't have access to education. Is that kind of what you also mean?
Yeah, for sure. That would be another great example of an epistemic bubble. I mean, you see it like all over the place in professional philosophy, both in terms of like the lack of, I shouldn't say lack, but like the underrepresentation of female voices in philosophy, but also just like philosophy from outside of the sort of Western European tradition, right? There are malicious explanations for some of that going on, and there are maybe more innocent explanations for some of it going on, but it is certainly the case that, you know, like you have to study ancient Greek philosophy in any philosophy bachelor's program anywhere in the country. Like at some point, you have to take a class on that and you cannot escape it. But the same is not true for like classical Chinese philosophy or Indian philosophy or anything like that. So, so
Do
very
you
much that, like I would say professional philosophy generally is an epistemic bubble.
do you also think that stuff like targeted ads and stuff like you know how the algorithm creates targeted or shows you targeted content, do you think that also creates this epistemic bubble without us even really wanting to create it?
Absolutely. And in fact, that kind of thing is my next example here. So without trying to do anything bad to you, Google is reinforcing your epistemic bubbles all the time, right? Because it's trying to show you the search results that you are most likely to click on so that they can sell ads better, basically. And in trying to do that job, it's going to show you stuff that you want to see, or at least stuff that makes you want to click, right? And that's going to bias you in various directions. So if we want to think about the sort of confirmation bias effect again, it might be just that Google is more likely to show you, you know, sources that tend to agree with the things that you say or support the views that you tend to be sympathetic to, because those are the ones you're more likely to click on. And so it can create this idea as you're sort of exploring the world, right? Like I'm just going to get information from the world. That's what Googling is, right? It's like me going to the world and pulling information from it. And I just get the information I get. And I don't think that hard about how that information is selected. So you might think that you're getting a kind of neutral, unbiased picture of whatever topic you're searching for when you Google for it. But really, you're getting personalized results, right? That are going to exclude voices that you are unlikely to click on, basically. So that's also going to create epistemic bubbles for you. That, again, I mean, it's malicious in a certain way, right? Like they're exploiting you for advertising revenue. But in this other way, it's not like Google's interested in misleading you, right? Like that's not the motive there. So it's not like as evil as it might be, I suppose you might say. But yeah, that'd be another good example of this kind of thing.
It's not
Also,
epistemically malicious. It might be morally malicious because capitalism, but it's not epistemically malicious.
yeah, that's a good way of putting it, right? They're not trying to trick you for the sake of tricking you or anything in that neighborhood. Also, any kind of like voluntary organization, like for example, the Sac State Philosophy Club, when you set up organizations like that, you're like getting a built-in epistemic bubble if there's any kind of connection between being interested in joining that kind of group and having views of a certain kind, like that philosophy is good, for example. Because of how philosophers are, you might get people showing up here to tell you that philosophy is bad. But in most kinds of things, right? Like if you, let's see, I'm trying to think of like, not weird, but like semi-bizarre online communities. Like I feel like online bodybuilding communities are like pretty strange in a variety of ways. And one of those ways is that you're going to see very different average views of the sort of health risks and benefits of steroid use in a bodybuilding community than you are outside of a bodybuilding community. And you can imagine why that would be, right? Just because that kind of community attracts people who have stronger incentives to use anabolic steroids than you or I probably do. I don't know that much about your lives, but so that sort of thing can happen. And again, it's not malicious. It's just that you're like organizing a group of people around a common interest. And so long as certain beliefs or attitudes or bodies of evidence are associated with having those interests, those things are going to be way overrepresented in those groups. And people who don't share those interests just aren't going to show up and make whatever criticisms they might make otherwise, right?
I'm reminded of in biology, the process of speciation is kind of the same way, where you isolate a population and through the sheer fact of random mutation and then natural selection in a new environment, you have a new species within however much time. A new species, as understood as something, a species that can't interbreed with its closest relative, I guess. And in the same way, you have online groups, or really technically any kind of group. Like the old forum would be like the small town. The non-metropolitan area. You have a group that's selected for people and relatively isolate by way of the dynamics of any kind of epistemic bubble, where you get an exclusion, everyone else is in some other epistemic bubble, et cetera, et cetera. And the material conditions underlying the thing that brought those people into this bubble in the first place, plus the sheer fact of random mutation, eventually brings them much sort of speciates the view into a form that's hard to recognize. I mean, that's just culture, to be honest, right?
I feel that speciation is a very extreme form of that, but a better maybe a better analogy would be how language is developed.
Yeah.
Through this epistemic, through this just kind of like essentially only hearing people from your area talk, and then the slang of your area then develops into its own form of language, essentially.
Yeah, both of those would be like similar kinds of models. Justin, did you have something? Okay, so this would just be sort of the epistemic version of that kind of thing, these epistemic bubbles. And epistemic bubbles, I think, are not that bad. I've tried to pitch them as not being malicious, but I mean, in a different way, they're not that bad. They're not that hard a problem to solve as these things go, because if you want to like escape an epistemic bubble, you're not really trapped in your bubble. Because unlike maybe being stuck in a small town and having no good way to travel any significant distance, you can access information from outside of your various bubbles fairly easily, right? You might need to go to some websites that you don't go to on a regular basis. You might need to like talk to a person in the world. That would be the worst outcome.
What?
But the idea is that like you can go to sources outside of the sources that you normally look at, and you're going to find disagreeing voices. And like that's a thing that you already know about the world, right? Like I'm not telling you any new information if I tell you that you can find someone to disagree with you about just about anything you believe. You just need to find the right corner of the internet to do that, or find a philosophy department, right? So escaping epistemic bubbles isn't a real concern. You're trapped in them in the sense that you might not notice they're there, and so you might not do anything about it. But if you know you're in an epistemic bubble, you can find your way out. Daniel?
Quick question, Professor Carey, and or potential counterexample. I have yet to, even amongst the most dedicated cat people in the world, I have yet to find a community that will disagree with me on the notion that puppies are not adorable.
Okay, so that might be true, but that might not be a matter of an epistemic bubble. It might just be that there are no people on Earth who hold that opinion, right? So, I mean, that's a kind of bubble, I suppose, like you're trapped on this particular planet. You might worry about like, I guess what I would say about that kind of situation where you can't find dissent no matter how hard you look, that might not be an epistemic bubble, right? There might just not be a voice that you're excluding there. It could be a very well-crafted bubble, I suppose, or something like that. But I'll say that as just a kind of general idea of like, what would be the solution to being in an epistemic bubble? I have at least a basic idea of how to answer that question, which is go outside the bubble and find some of those voices you're missing out on. I mentioned that as a sort of easy sounding solution because this other kind of structure, that won't work for. And this is the kind of structure that I'm worried about, that I don't have a quick and easy solution for dealing with. And that's an echo chamber. So sometimes people use epistemic bubble and echo chamber kind of interchangeably. I want to be at least reasonably clear in including this additional factor in echo chamber. in echo chambers rather. So in an echo chamber, it's not just that you don't hear opposing views. In an echo chamber, you're taught to not trust opposing views, to think that anyone who disagrees with whatever the like core tenets of the echo chamber might be, anyone like that is trying to mislead you. Like they are not just unreliable, but malicious and trying to trick you about what the world is like. That's the kind of thing that's going on in an echo chamber. And examples of these are theoretically a little bit more exotic than the examples of epistemic bubbles. So the standard kind of echo chamber example would be a cult. So if I wanted to start a cult, I might, recruit a group of impressionable philosophy students, and I might tell them some, wild story about the world that is very different from the common sense view of the world. But there's a problem in trying to set up your cult and just doing that, right? Which is that your cult members are also going to talk to other people, and other people are going to tell them that your like wild story about how things really are is totally obviously false. Worse yet, they might give them evidence that shows that your wild story about the world is totally obviously false. So you really want to avoid that kind of thing happening. So you could isolate, right? Like we're going to move to this like remote spot in the mountains and you're not allowed to talk to anybody else, break all ties with your family. Like that's a cult strategy that can work. But there's a way easier strategy, which is that you just say, look, this is the way things really are. The teachings of the cult are the truth. And there is, for whatever reason, according to whatever story you want to tell, there are powerful forces that want to keep that a secret. And so they have managed to fool everyone outside the cult into thinking, the common sense view about whatever it is. And so you will see all of this evidence that seems to indicate that the teachings of the cult are false. But all of that is manufactured evidence. Any evidence that you encounter like that is part of this cover-up to keep people from learning the truth. And if I can convince my cult members of that kind of story, I don't have to isolate them from the rest of the world anymore. Because whatever they find out there in the world will either support my cult theory, or if it counts against it, they can dismiss it as just being part of the cover-up, right? This is just some of that misleading evidence that we were told to expect out here in the world, right? Here it is happening just as our glorious leader said it would. They're trying to trick us, right? It's like anything that ought to count as evidence against your teachings ends up in this roundabout way counting in favor of the story that you've told overall. So that's the kind of insidious feature of the echo chamber, is that it has this built-in counter argument. I'm getting like some wild background noise. I'm not sure which direction it's coming from.
I don't know either. I can mute folks to see if it helps.
Justin adds in that that used to be relegated to just cults and a ... I believe.
Don't worry, more examples are coming. So
would you like to elaborate though, Justin?
Yeah, it's
I have a feeling Professor Carey is going to elaborate. I'm just saying,
yeah. We may be headed in the same direction here, but if I don't get to what you're thinking of, feel free to add it in. So
we're going there.
Yeah. So from the description that I was giving about how the sort of cult cover-up strategy would work, it's not a far jump at all to start thinking about sort of contemporary conspiracy groups, right? So like Sandy Hook deniers or whatever, who have to say not only was there no shooting, but in fact, all of the people who claim to be parents of the children who died, they are paid actors and actresses that are part of this massive conspiracy to, I don't know, false flag something. I don't know the whole story, right? But the idea is that it's built into conspiracy theories that there's a conspiracy, right? It's like part of what makes it a conspiracy theory, that there's this cover up to prevent people from finding out. And that's why it's hard. Well, that's a reason that it's hard to disrupt conspiracy thinking, is that whatever evidence you show that the conspiracy is not true, it's like, okay, well, that's part of the cover up, whatever that evidence is. So anything that might be a powerful argument that the conspiracy claims aren't true just becomes further reinforcement for the idea that there's a cover up. And then also this kind of effect is pretty widespread like throughout contemporary US politics. And I don't know that that's like a new feature. Sometimes people say things like misinformation is way worse than it used to be. News sources are less trustworthy and whatever. And I don't know, there have been some pretty scummy times in the history of journalism in this country. So I'd be surprised if things were like worse than they had ever been. But there is this thing that's true, which is that it's so easy to talk to so many people all the time. And that probably does exacerbate things in certain ways. But we'll get to like a pretty concrete example here, but you can imagine if like me, there is someone in your family with radically different political views than yours, you may have had conversations where they say something that is obviously false. You explain to them why it is obviously false. And maybe you even provide them with like good, credible sources that demonstrate that what they're saying is false. And they come back at you not with, well, here's like the objection to that argument. Here's like the error in your statistical reasoning. They instead say that your sources are biased sources, that like the information you're getting is bad information from people trying to mislead you. And maybe you're lucky enough to not have anyone like this in your family, but if you've had that kind of experience, that's the kind of thing I have in mind, that part of what's going on with political polarization in this country is that our political discussions are becoming more and more echo chambery, or maybe not more and more, but they're pretty echoey, in that it's not just that like we have a party with one set of values and a party with a different set of values, and they disagree about what's important, and so they push for different kinds of policies. Instead, we have disagreement over basic matters of facts, about like reports of events and whether they happened or not. And each side teaches you not to trust the other side. Right?
Chase makes a good point that it's bold of you to assume that any of us are not that person in the family. Not that we have the person, but that we are that person. Would Chase like to elaborate?
Let's just say that philosophy is not looked favorably upon in my family.
Happens to a lot of families.
And Justin adds that framing has replaced discourse, and that is a damn fine point, Justin.
Yeah, and concisely put too.
My
So
parents still tell everybody that I'm a psychology major.
Ouch. That's absolutely savage. One thing that I would like to observe, just because I think we're about to transition into the deep conceptual epistemic problem with about echo chambers and how this relates to what we talked about in the past. One thing that I will like submit for the consideration of the viewer and the audience and the attendees is that a lot of the formation of echo chambers can be explained through like underlying material conditions and the interests of the leadership of whatever group. So with that, going by way of saying this is something that emerges from the human condition, but it's not like inherent to it. This is a solvable problem in a political sense. So cults are a really good example. The leader obviously has to keep people under control. So he targets the most vulnerable people epistemically and financially. Usually financially, I should say. Scientology is a good exception here, but like generally, somehow people are highly vulnerable, highly susceptible to hearing a new kind of story, and so the cult leader, as a way of even maybe unconsciously like maintaining control of the population, introduces the like element of unfalsifiability into a world-building narrative in order to get people to believe and to continue to believe and to sort of evolve and migrate their beliefs along a sort of set trajectory within a community. And he sets up an echo chamber so that the people are easier to control, even though the things he's telling them are hyperbolic, let's say, untruthful. If I were being extra charitable. Political parties are kind of the same way. They have to maintain a block of voters, and so if their views are wrong and bad, it's much easier than to change those views to just introduce an element of unfalsifiability to the story. Set your opponents up as the evil party, not just the people who are mistaken, and you have significantly more stable voting bloc. If those people whom you're targeting are somehow especially financially or epistemically vulnerable, all the better. It's much easier to get that narrative through to such folks.
But
So,
by
like,
the way, if
solvable problem is what I mean to
if
say.
you're looking for a way to liven up this presentation, dear viewers in the future or what have you, take a drink every time William says the phrase material conditions. It's a grand old time.
All right, that sounds like a dangerous game, but that's all right. No, so I'll say I think all of that is true. It's also true that you can sort of put yourself in an echo chamber as a way of maintaining the beliefs you already have, right? If you're attached to them for reasons other than they're supported by the evidence, right? Like you can tell yourself a story just as the cult leader would tell you a story. So this doesn't have to be a case of like a person exploiting another person. That happens a lot, but it's also something that you can sort of do to yourself intentionally or otherwise. The key thing that I want to point out about echo chambers, the thing that makes them worrying and makes them make that problem of disagreement worse, is that looking for new information is not a good way of getting outside of an echo chamber. Like if you're stuck in an echo chamber and you want to break out, looking for outside voices is not a good way of doing it, because you're going to encounter one of two kinds of voices. You will either encounter voices that agree with you, and that will just reinforce the things you already believe, or you're going to encounter voices that disagree with you, but you've been taught not to trust those voices. So they will have no impact on what you believe, right?
Or they will
So,
reinforce it by way of the
yeah,
sort of
right. The sort of judo effect of if my conspiracy story is true, I'm expecting to see counter information out there. So then when you see it, like you're just continuing to reinforce the broader story, right? So finding new information doesn't help you get out of echo chambers. So that's the contribution to my overall project of don't look for more information, or not don't look for it, but it's not like the panacea. It's not going to fix all of your epistemic problems. So let's think about an example. So we have two people, red and blue. They disagree about who won the 2020 US presidential election. You can fill them in with whatever characters you like. Red thinks that Trump won, blue thinks that Biden won. And then here is their situation. Here's like their informational epistemic situation. Red gets all their information from sources that confirm that Trump won, and also tell them not to trust any sources that say otherwise. Fill in your favorite news source. Blue gets all of their information from sources that confirm that Biden won, and they also tell them not to trust sources that say otherwise. Fill in your favorite news source. So here's the beginning of the puzzle. Who's in an echo chamber in this situation? Both, right? By definition, they're both in echo chambers.
This is essentially, I definitely see the parallel to the disagreement problem you're bringing up, because just like, even if it mirrors the disagreement, because both of them say one thing and they don't really trust each other, so therefore no one, it's like essentially they don't. I'm trying to think of a good way to say it, but
well, maybe this is the point you're getting at, and maybe it's not. But here's a thing to notice: that the second part of Zhuangzi's argument, like, who should we get to settle this dispute for us? Should we get someone who agrees with you? Should we get someone who agrees with me? Neither of those things is going to work. This just makes all of that worse, right? Because all we're going to do, we can find someone who agrees with red, but that's not going to matter because blue's not going to trust that source. We can find someone who agrees with blue, but that's not going to matter because red's not going to trust that source. So there's like this way in which there's the practical problem of like the disagreement is intractable. Like, I don't know how either of them can persuade the other, but there's also a rational problem, right? Which is that like they each have reasons for what they believe, and they have reasons to not trust counter evidence. We might say different things about the reliability of their sources, but like from the inside, those reasons look like good testimonial reasons to each of them. So there's this concern about rationality. Well, I'll pause that for just a moment. But the key thing here is that they're both in echo chambers, just by definition of what an echo chamber is, which reveals something interesting about the definition of an echo chamber, by the way. And that's my first to the extent that I like have a thesis, here's the first one. It's not clear to me that it's always bad to be in an echo chamber, because no part of the definition of echo chamber says that like you're teaching each other false things and you're teaching each other to distrust good sources, right? It's just that people in your community tend to agree and you're taught to distrust sources who disagree about like the core tenets of the echo chamber. But I think that sometimes that's good. Sometimes we ought to teach people to distrust certain kinds of sources that disagree with them about a certain range of things, right? So if we're in a hostile epistemic environment, and we know that there are at least some sources, maybe lots of sources, that routinely spread bad information about the world, then we really ought to teach people not to trust those sources. I mean, we like as people, but also like I'm thinking about myself as like an educator. Like part of what I take myself to be doing is teaching people how to think. I think if I were teaching young people, I would take even more seriously this idea that like we should be teaching media literacy. We should be teaching them how to evaluate sources and not to believe sources of certain kinds. And in particular, not to believe sources that tell them certain kinds of things about the world. But in doing that, we're like intentionally constructing an echo chamber. But I also think that in doing that, we're doing something good. So from those two things, I infer that making an echo chamber is just not always a bad thing. Sometimes it's like your epistemic obligation to make an echo chamber, because that's part of what it is to inoculate people against misinformation. Like you got to give them some strategies for resisting and not trusting these bad sources, or they're going to fall into the bad kind of echo chamber, right? They're going to join the cults. They're going to believe the conspiracy theories, etc.
I think there's and maybe you're going here. There's a way of maybe parsing this out, because like at least as presented originally, the vibe I got was that like an echo chamber teaches you to distrust all contrary sources, all and this sort of thing. Whereas like if you're like I'll go ahead and like put my cards on the table here that Donald Trump did not win the 2020 election.
That's
he
true.
just didn't. And
Right.
like, but with that,
Yeah, I
despite
saw Michigan flip in the night.
like, despite me being a liberal, I'm not putting forth the notion of do not trust any conservative voice or media site or what have you. So I'm not trying to like build an echo chamber. I'm trying to attack particular sources. So that sort of might be the difference. Are they telling you to distrust everyone who says anything contrary or most things, or just kind of particular things, and it can contextually depend, and we can evaluate one as better than another in that sort of sense?
Yeah, so that's a reasonable thing to think about. And I guess my inclination would be that if we're going to make sense of echo chambers as like an actual phenomenon that exists, we don't want to limit ourselves to just the cases where they say, here are all of the true propositions, and you should distrust anyone who disagrees with you about any of these. Probably the way most actual echo chambers work is that there are like certain core beliefs, and anyone who disagrees with you about those is a bad source that you shouldn't trust. Right. So I'm taking like Biden won the election as a core proposition of my epistemic community. And I think that in general, we tell each other any source that says otherwise is a bad source that you shouldn't trust. It doesn't follow that all sources with like any conservative political leanings in the United States are bad sources, right? Because there are plenty of conservative sources that are not going to disagree with you about this proposition. So it's not that like any disagreement with any proposition in the chamber is always evidence of the cover up, right? But the core basic stuff, whatever exactly that is, right? So
By the way,
and you might think
Justin,
of different.
No, Justin put in the chat. So if you were teaching a class, teaching a geology class that deals with paleontology, would you allow students to believe in creationism?
If that question's for me, my students are allowed to believe whatever they want, but they got to put the right answers on the tests. So, but I do think that like classrooms are also good examples of echo chambers, right? There are voices that we intentionally exclude from classrooms and that we would tell our students to distrust if they encountered them, right? Like if I'm, the geology class is a totally fine example, or if I'm like teaching an astronomy class, I'm not going to have a guest speaker who comes in and like teaches geocentrism. Like those voices are excluded on purpose because we know they're wrong and we know that they are good at tricking people. And so we should teach people not to trust them, right? Like just like you would teach someone not to trust a magician, right? Like that's a skill that you should have as an adult in the world. You should know that people can trick you into thinking they can levitate or whatever. I think similarly, like educating children now, like we need to teach them that bad sources can look just like good sources, and here are the kinds of things that you shouldn't trust. So I think like a more complicated response to your concern, Daniel, would be to say that the echoiness comes in degrees or something like that. Some chambers are like super closed off and you can't disagree with anything. Some allow disagreement with like a broad range of what they say, but they're, you know, there's a list of core beliefs that can't be challenged or something like that. But anyway, the core thing that I want to get across is just that I think sometimes that's good. Sometimes that's a good epistemic practice to say, these are the basic facts about the world, and anybody who disagrees with you about these, they're trying to trick you. Because I think that's true. But when we do that, we make echo chambers. So then you might think this. You might think, well, okay, the definition of echo chamber doesn't guarantee that echo chambers are bad, but there are bad echo chambers, right? Like the cult is a bad echo chamber. The conspiracy theory groups, those are bad echo chambers. And you might tell different stories about why they're bad, right? Maybe it's because they teach you to believe bad sources and distrust good ones. Maybe it's because the beliefs in the echo chamber that they're saying can't be challenged are false beliefs. Maybe it's some other kind of thing. But the idea is, once you get, I'm assuming everyone just agrees with me now that some echo chambers are good, then the question is like, well, how do we distinguish who's in the good echo chamber and who's in the bad echo chamber, right? Our question can't be like, if we're trying to decide who's in a better epistemic position, red or blue, the question can't be who's in an echo chamber, because they both are. If we want to distinguish them, we got to say, well, who's in the bad echo chamber, right? The echo chamber that's reinforcing inaccurate beliefs about the world, right? So I think that's red, but I'm gonna have a hard time convincing red of that, of course. That's the practical problem. But then there's this epistemic problem. And the epistemic problem is like, they're red and blue have symmetrical epistemic situations. They each have a bunch of sources that, you know, look credible. They all have fancy logos and whatever. And their sources tell them a story about what the world is like. And each story involves the other side intentionally trying to mislead them. So they've got this built-in echo chamber feature. How, in this kind of disagreement, can we settle the question of who's in a bad echo chamber? How can we come to know who's in the bad echo chamber so that we can settle this actually even more important question, which is, how do we know who won the election, right? Like that's the thing we have to actually figure out here. That's the thing that we need to establish. And I guess there are different answers we can give to that question. So here's an answer. Chuangzi says we can't, right? The conclusion of the disagreement argument is just that nobody can know anything. I say that's unacceptable. I'm accelerating slightly here because it's getting late, but I say that's unacceptable. Here's why. We got to know who won the election, because you shouldn't let someone be president unless you know they won the presidential election, or like, you know, through the appropriate succession process became president, right? Like you shouldn't let people be president unless you know that they have met the relevant requirements for being president. So it's unacceptable to be skeptical about this proposition. That's not like, that's not a very good response to a skeptical argument. I'm just telling you, I'm unwilling to accept this solution to the puzzle, but it is technically a solution to the puzzle. Like it's an answer to the problem, right? You can say there just is no way to know. I hope for something better. Okay, so here's the answer that most people say when I explain this problem. They say, get more information. And that comes in different forms about what kind of information you should get, what kinds of sources you should consult, and so on. But basically, the response always ends up being that that just won't work. Because of the structure of an echo chamber, getting more information won't work. Because the information that you get is going to confirm both people's beliefs, but different beliefs, right? The information, you know, suppose we ask the New York Times who won the election, right? That's going to support Blue's belief about this proposition, about Biden winning the election. but it's also going to support Red's belief that the New York Times is a biased source full of garbage, right? So there's no kind of information, or at least unless someone has a better idea about what the relevant sort of information would be, I can't think of a kind of information that would actually rationally settle this dispute from the inside. So that's not going to work, I say. Here's a third thing that people sometimes say. They say you should think for yourself. You should not rely on sources. You should not rely on testimony, because testimony can be misleading. So you should evaluate the evidence yourself. And then that does two things, right? First of all, you can figure out who won the election. And second, you can figure out which set of sources is a bad set of sources, right? Because you figured out on your own that whoever won the election. And so all the sources who said otherwise, those are the bad sources, problem solved. Which, like, for some examples might be fine. For things that you can like go and check yourself with a reasonable amount of time and effort, maybe that's a way of breaking the stalemate. But it's not going to be for this kind of proposition, right? Like, I don't have access to the ballots or the machines that were used to track everyone's votes. And even if I did, I don't have time to count them myself, right? I take the words of the various secretaries of state from the various states in the nation, that the vote counts for those states were what they were. And then someone who is better at electoral math than I am figures out how that translates into actually winning the presidency. And I believe what they believe, because I don't have the time, energy, or access to get the evidence I would need to answer this question for myself, right? So even if like Red and Blue were like, okay, we're going to start from scratch and we're just going to figure out the answer to this question, they don't have time. They have lives, they have jobs. Like, there's no way. There's no way they can do that for this proposition. And we need to settle these kinds of disputes for like dozens or hundreds of propositions about basic facts about what's going on in the world that people disagree about. So this is just an impractical solution. That's not to say it wouldn't work in the like philosophical sense, but it's just that we can't do it. Okay, there's a fourth thing. This is Nguyen's idea about how to get out of echo chambers, although he admits it's, I was gonna say he admits it's bad. That's probably not what he says. He admits it has limitations. I'll say that. So, and it's a sort of weak version of like being Descartes, right? So like, imagine you're Descartes at the beginning of the meditations, you're like, I'm giving up all of my beliefs, and then I'm gonna start from scratch, and I'm gonna build up from just the things I can't be wrong about, and I'm going to use valid inferences to get to other things that I then therefore also can't be wrong about, and I'm going to have this perfect structure of beliefs, and I can't be wrong about any of them. Wouldn't that be awesome? Okay, so we know that doesn't work, right? Like, that project failed. But you could do a weaker thing, which is you could start from scratch with your sources, right? Because part of the problem of echo chambers is that whoever gets to you first has you, right? Because you go into one echo chamber or another, and then that chamber tells you not to trust anyone from outside. But if you had joined the other echo chamber first, if you had like joined the cult across the street, right, you would have had a totally different set of beliefs, and they would have told you not to trust anybody who disagrees with those, right? So it's just like an accident that you ended up trusting this set of sources first, and they discredited all of the other sources. And that seems really weird, right? Like, that shouldn't actually determine what it's rational for you to believe. So you might start from scratch with your sources and say, okay, I'm going to stop trusting sources. I'm going to give up all of my beliefs about who's a reliable source and who's an unreliable source. And I'm going to build up from scratch using only sources that I have a pretty good reason to think are good sources, right? Not like Cartesian certainty, but just a pretty good reason to think that they are good sources. But here's a problem that I can't solve. You have this set of sources now, and you're like agnostic about whether they're good or bad. And you have to start choosing some of them to trust. And when you do that, you know that you risk ending up in a bad echo chamber. How do you decide which sources to start trusting, given that you have no background evidence now? You've given up all of your background evidence about which sources are reliable and which sources are unreliable. Right? You're going to go out into the world, and there are all these voices yelling stuff at you, and you have to like pick some of them to trust as your information about the world. And I just can't think of a good mechanism for identifying the trustworthy sources over the untrustworthy sources that doesn't collapse back into one of these other answers that won't work, right? Like, you could start by picking sources that confirm the things that you've checked yourself, but the things that we're talking about involve so much information that you're just not in a position to check even one of them yourself. So I'm pretty down on the prospects for the epistemic reset project, just because I don't think anyone has a general solution to this problem of you have a bunch of sources who disagree with each other on the basis of no information at all, choose which ones to trust. So those are bad solutions, I think. I don't have a good solution. I told you that at the beginning, I think. So hopefully I'm not disappointing you. I do have a related sort of puzzle to worry about.
Oh, good.
But
Worry about,
actually,
yes.
well, it's maybe just another way of putting the kind of concern that I'm getting at. So I'll just do it very quickly.
Yes.
And this concern is something like, forget knowledge, because knowledge is confusing and involves all this extra stuff. So I don't know, maybe we can't know, fine. Like, let's be skeptics. Here's a different question. What is the rational response to being in this situation? I mean, the practically rational response might just be to stop talking to this person. But what is the epistemically rational response to this puzzle of like, how do I know that I'm not in the bad echo chamber, right? If our situations are parallel, what makes me think I'm the one who's got it right? So again, we've got red with strong testimonial reasons, in at least one sense of strong, for doubting all of blue's sources, for mistrusting all of those sources. And when you're in that situation, right, like think about the testimony from the sources you trust tells you the world is this way, and anyone who tells you otherwise is part of this cover-up to convince you that the world is not really this way. And there's some, plausible seeming explanation about why they would do that. Well, then it seems like you have good reasons for distrusting those sources. The same kinds of reasons that you would have if, your school teachers taught you shouldn't trust this or that kind of news source, right? Like you have an authoritative testimonial source that you've decided to trust, hopefully for a reason, but who knows, who's giving you these testimonial reasons. And the same is true on the other side, right? Like this is just the point that their epistemic positions are symmetrical. And so this leads to a general kind of concern about echo chambers. This is one of the things that is super interesting about Nguyen's work, is that a lot of people think that people in echo chambers like must have done something wrong to end up in an echo chamber. Like they must have been doing a bunch of epistemically irrational stuff. They must be continuing to be epistemically irrational. How can they not just see the facts and realize how wrong they are, right? But there's this, when you sort of look at an echo chamber from the inside, in terms of how most of us rely on testimony, it looks like a rational thing to do to stay in the echo chamber, right? You have reasons to believe the core beliefs of the echo chamber and reasons to doubt anyone who questions those beliefs. And they're, obviously somebody's set of reasons here is misleading, right? But in terms of like how they look pretty similar, right? They look like cable news stations. They're just different cable news stations, right? They look like, politically themed Facebook groups. They're just different groups, right? So there's this worry that it seems generally rational to stay in an echo chamber once you're in one, but then it sure seems like being in an echo chamber is bad. I said earlier that it wasn't bad, and I meant that. Like, I think there are reasons to think that sometimes it's good to build an echo chamber, but there is something that seems epistemically very worrying about being in a situation where you know that you're not going to react to counter evidence, or you're going to react to it only by becoming more confident in the views that you already have, right? Something about that seems very epistemically suspicious. So this is like a sort of parallel puzzle. This is not about knowledge or about figuring out which proposition is true, but just like, what is the rational thing to do once you realize I'm in an echo chamber, you're in an echo chamber, we disagree. Like, what should we think now? What should we do? Like, we can't, like, we've talked about various solutions that won't actually help settle the dispute, but also like, am I being rational now in maintaining my beliefs, having noted that I'm in this kind of, I don't know, interaction of echo chambers situation, right? Unless I can, here's maybe a way to put the challenge. Unless I can produce a good reason to think that my echo chamber is the good kind and your echo chamber is the bad kind, unless I have some evidence that suggests that I've got the good sources, then it doesn't seem rational for me to continue trusting my sources. I mean, that's what I'm going to do, but it doesn't seem like it would be rational for me to do that. So that's the worry.
I think I've got if this is the appropriate time, I think I've got the beginnings of a solution.
Great, fix it.
Okay, so it's not the beliefs themselves, they're probably not in the, but like you're undoubtedly, your echo chambers are going to have particularities to them. The story they tell about the opposition and how they deceive you and what they do to deceive you is going to have some picture above and beyond. They just lie about the numbers. You can show you 1,000 things and they're just lying. It might retreat to that. They might retreat to that, but they're going to put forth an initial notion that's more robust than that, and particularly about the agents that believe differently than you, like definitely more robust than that. And that's testable. Like if I'm hypothetically speaking, and Dylan might appreciate this, if I'm hypothetically speaking, going down the MRA Reddit bro rabbit hole or whatever, and then being told feminists are unreasonable and just hate you because you're a man, I'm not saying that confirmation bias doesn't play a factor in here, but that's testable. And if in fact feminists don't hate you and don't react to immediate massive hostility like you're being told that they almost always do, then the notion of learning to thinking for yourself has some sort of merit. And similarly, on the other side, if feminists are telling you, these Reddit bros are all just toxic and just hate women, and you go on there and lo and behold, wouldn't you know it, they do all just seem to hate women and say nasty things about women. That's reason to think your echo chamber is better than someone else's, because the things and the particular story told about the other side has more merit.
Okay, yeah. So my first inclination about that kind of example is to say that those don't seem like very good echo chambers to me. And what I mean by that is that it's not clear in that story that you're equipped with the kind of pre-counter evidence that you would be in a conspiracy theory situation, right? If it was if the story was feminists or Reddit bros, whichever you like, are horrible, toxic people who hate you, but they'll pretend like they don't, because that's how they sort of cover up this fact that they secretly hate you. Well, then if I go and interact with whichever group and they're nice to me, now that confirms the story, right? That's like an echo chamber setup. If it's just that, oh yeah, go ahead.
Allow me to sort of tweak or more robust, or like in terms of epistemic terms, they'll twist these statistics around, or if you even mention these sorts of things, all this happens. My general point is that, with the exception of, just because we talked about how these things can come in degrees earlier, with the exception of just outright cults, the echo chamber isn't going to be perfectly unfalsifiable. And I'm not saying that, okay, well, we'll just disregard cults, and oh well, I guess it sucks for people who are in cults, too bad, that's a bit of a callous thing. But if we could solve this for everything other than perfect cults, I don't know, I think that's worth something.
So I don't think you're wrong. I just want to make sure that the solution we're appealing to is effective against genuine echo chambers, against echo chambers that come equipped with a plausible story about why you will find evidence that counts against our beliefs out there, right? Or that should count against our beliefs. Because that's the thing that makes the echo chamber insidious, right? Is the evidence that should convince you that the story is bad ends up supporting the story. So So I'll say that's the problem that I'm interested in solving. It might be that only the best echo chambers really have a good story like that. You can do it in US politics really easily, right? The other side is lying to you so they can win the next election. There's always a motivation. So built into the system, right? So you don't have to tell any fancy story about why people would lie. And those stories are like pre-existing on both sides, right? That the elites or the leadership on either side are basically exploiting their voters to maintain political power by lying to them and telling them things that they want to hear, or things that will make them afraid, or things that will whatever, right? Like those stories are already around for those kinds of echo chambers. So that's the kind that I'm worried about, is an echo chamber that has a built-in, like, plausible story about why you will find disagreement out there, but that shouldn't make you doubt, you know, the commandments or whatever the core tenets of the echo chamber.
I do worry that, you know, on this sort of setup, like you mentioned, that, you know, you're not going to defend fallibilism, you're just going to assume it. I do worry that we've sort of like axiomatized the problem into being unsolvable, because like if you're only interested in the echo chambers that have this really, really robust response for how to deal with contrary information, any counterexample I come up with runs the risk of not actually being the kind of echo chamber you're talking about.
Yeah, so I agree, and that's a criticism worth thinking about. So it might be that I have defined echo chambers in such a way that there aren't any, or that they're not very many, or something like that, that nothing actually satisfies the conditions of what I'm interested in. I do think that's a thing worth worrying about with philosophical theories. I don't worry about that in this particular case, just because I think I see structures all over the place that have that kind of feature. I think, you know, like cults and conspiracy theory groups are classic, uncontroversial examples of that kind of thing, that have exactly the features I'm interested in. If I'm making a controversial claim about examples, it's just that US political parties are also like that. But I don't even know how controversial that is. But it might be that there are other things that we think are similar in structure that don't have this problem. I'm perfectly happy to say that. So like maybe there are a bunch of epistemic bubbles that wouldn't be echo chambers on my definition, or maybe not the interesting kind of echo chamber if we want something narrower. And they might raise their own epistemic problems. They wouldn't face this one. So maybe there's like damage control kind of responses like that we could give. Shailaja, did you have something?
Yeah, I have a couple things. So, about the situation with politics and stuff. Did you know in India, our current Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, who's been in power for the last 2 terms consecutively as Prime Minister, and before that, two consecutive terms as Chief Minister of Gujarat. But he has been for the last 20 years basically been propagating this extreme Hindu nationalist view that wherein he's trying to literally kick out all the minorities, and especially the Muslims in all over India.
So I'll say I did not know that, but I'm like 0% surprised to hear it, right? Like I feel like that story is a pretty common story in international politics. Yeah.
And considering how many people Modi has benefited over the last 20 years, especially how many people in power he has benefited in the last 20 years, has created this echo chamber where his views are the ones that are being echoed a lot more because of the people in power.
Yeah. So that's like that's a further thing to worry about, I suppose, with echo chambers, in terms of, I think I described it earlier as the practical problem of like how to settle the dispute. But when you have like when an echo chamber encompasses some major part of the widely available media, like it becomes even more worrying, right? Because then now you're not talking about like, a relatively small number of people in a cult with a particularly charismatic leader, right? It's becoming like the default view of, hundreds of millions of people. Because it's really bad in a case where it's just like totally state-run media. But even in cases that are not like that, you can end up with this hugely amplified voice of a particular echo chamber, and then you catch a lot more people in the trap, and it's even harder to get out.
Yeah, because of how many people in power support Modi, it has become so that basically all of media is controlled by him. All of media is controlled by, and to the extent that people speaking up against him or saying even like the slightest bit of, even like comedians are getting arrested for making like small jokes about something. But another thing I was a little more interested about was the idea of the an epistemic reset.
Mhm.
And I was wondering how you meant that, because I could see that in like a few different ways, where like one would be where if this whole generation of old people just died, and we could have like a fresh bunch of ideas. Not I'm not talking about like
Just naturally die,
old.
right?
I'm just talking
Yeah.
about like
Naturally,
older.
but all
Yeah,
at once.
like COVID did a
The
little bit
boomer
of that.
remover.
Right. Yeah, no, I think I understand what you mean. Yeah.
But or the other way, where we start teaching the new generation of kids, everybody, critical thinking.
Yeah. Okay, good. So I like, well, I shouldn't say I like both of those ideas, because maybe the first one, I'm not like advocating.
One of them was genocide, unfortunately. I regret to report.
But these are both good kinds of resets to think about. They're different from the kind of reset I was thinking about. I was thinking about like an individual reset. Like, I'm worried that I'm trapped in an echo chamber, so I am going to demolish all of my beliefs about which sources to trust, and then start from scratch in that sense. But those are also interesting ideas if you think like, we're worried that a particular echo chamber has too much like control and influence, and that like too many US senators are members or something like that. Well, we could elect some new senators, and then we wouldn't have made the echo chamber go away, but we would have given it less influence over American politics, as a kind of example. So when people are like, why is the average age of the Senate so high? That's maybe a similar kind of proposal, right? The idea of an across generations reset of like, let's prepare young people by teaching them critical thinking to sort of avoid echo chambers. I am generally in favor of that kind of thing, but I'm worried that it doesn't help with this problem, because I think that if we're doing that in a responsible way, part of what we need to do is teach them to not trust certain kinds of sources. And in doing that, we're going to be constructing an echo chamber. Like, we're going to be putting them in one on purpose. And I think we think and we hope that it's a good kind of echo chamber, right, where they're believing good sources and distrusting bad ones. But unless we find a good way of answering this question of like, how do we settle which sources are the good sources, then I worry about any plan to like, indoctrinate the next generation of children to only trust certain kinds of sources and be suspicious of others. So
just tell them to question everything.
Well, so we can, right? But they got to form beliefs. Like, that's all. That's to get to sort of point 3 here, is that they need to rely on outside information to have the kinds of beliefs we're expected to have about the world. Like, there's just no getting around that. So it's kind of that cluster of things that makes it hard to find an answer. And I think the answer of how do we teach those intro critical thinking classes is just a more complicated version of the question of what's the rational thing for me to do in this situation. And I don't even know the answer to the simpler question. So I really don't know the answer to the more complex one. Justin?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, like, obviously you're talking about all of this in the realm of the social media era. And I think video evidence really does add a different level of epistemic knowledge to all situations that we're talking about, in which like there could be issues of framing that are taking place between red and blue. But at the end of the day, if there is video evidence of said incident, everybody gets to see the video and make up their own mind. And I think that is, it is a relatively new feature into certainly the political landscape, because it was far too easy before everybody had a cell phone that could take video for politicians to just lie about whatever they wanted to lie about. And yet now everybody in the audience, every time a politician speaks, has a video recorder in their pocket. It makes it a lot harder for politicians to get away with the lying that they used to be able to get away with. And I mean, in terms of like an epistemic reset, I feel like video evidence gives us a decent place to start if we were going to try to start from scratch. Like, you can trust your own eyes without having to have the framing coming from the news sources on the right or the news sources on the left. You can just trust your own eyes and see the video evidence and make up your own mind.
Yeah, good. So I think I have two main concerns with that as like as a broad solution. So the first is that I think we want to be able to form rational beliefs about a bunch of propositions where we don't have that kind of evidence available to us. So if it's like, did so-and-so say this during this speech? Like, we can go to the video evidence for that kind of question, but the video evidence isn't going to count the votes in the election for us. It might be relevant to lots of other related propositions, right? Like about what people said at certain times, on election day or something like that, as might like text messages and various other kinds of information. That stuff could all be relevant to the question of like whether there's been a certain cover up, but to the proposition of who won the election, I mean, the relevant evidence is like diffuse. It's like all over the country. A lot of it's old now. And there's not a single or even a set of dozens of video clips that will settle that kind of question for us. So I agree that like is an important kind of evidence and like a useful tool that we didn't always have. So it is virtuous in that way. But the other thing I'll say that I worry about is that it's like not that hard to make perfectly convincing deepfake videos. And given that, I am like way down on video evidence compared to where I used to be. You used to have this idea that it would take like a room full of supercomputers several weeks to create like a convincing fake video of someone saying something, but that's just not the world anymore. So, part of that is like, if you think about like how well suited we are to the information we're presented with, there are peaks and valleys at various points, right? So when video evidence, became relatively easy to acquire and hadn't yet become very easy to doctor, we were like in a little bit better position. But as we now get better and better at faking it, we're going to be in a worse position because we're just not going to have the skills to sort the real videos from the fake videos. So that's the second kind of worry about that sort of evidence. I agree with your point overall. I just think the clock is ticking on how long video evidence is going to be, an especially good kind of evidence. I should say that I should go soon. I don't want to like kill discussion and leave immediately, but I can maybe do a couple more things and then I should go to bed, basically. I think that Daniel is next on the Zoom list here.
I'll be quicker in mine than I was going to be and just say that, like we do see people who leave cults. We do see people presumably who no longer believe that the earth is flat. And I think we can look to see what ultimately got them out of these bubbles and sort of form the strategy. And I would, be willing to put a decent amount of money down that it is something similar to what I've suggested of just, at some point, the deep fakes that the other sides are doing, they just sort of went like, nah, they're just way too committed there. But that's neither here nor there. Just bring up that, we do see people break out of these things. I'm much more interested to hear what Dylan has to say, and Diana.
Okay, great. Well, what do you have to say, Dylan? Or, oh, Dylan disappeared. Deanna?
I'm still here.
Oh, you are. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry, I lowered my hand prematurely. My bad.
No problem.
So I'll be honest, I originally raised my hand because I just wanted to feel included with everyone else who was raising their hand. But then Justin said something and I think both you and Daniel kind of hit on the same point about deep fakes. Like I've been in the digital world for a while now, and even though it's not there yet, it is quickly getting there, and at least that's from my perspective. And I feel like it would only add to this conversation in that once it gets there, it's only going to add to the whole, echo chamber in that, oh no, that you don't trust that the other person is not using a deep fake, at that kind of a thing, and yeah, anyway, sorry, I just wanted to say something because everyone else was raising their hands. So anyway,
Don't apologize for participating, Dylan.
If I could just rebut real quickly, I think my point about video evidence actually kind of will end up being a trump card over deepfakes. I think the fact that you're not going to have like multiple sources for a deepfake, you're going to have the one deepfake versus many multiple sources of actual video footage of what actually took place. I think deepfakes are not going to be part of the political discourse in the way that a lot of people are worried about. I just really don't. I think there's going to be plenty of ways to discredit deepfakes in such a way that it never really becomes a part of the problem. But maybe that's just where my knowledge of everything is at, and I could be very I could have a lot of hermeneutical dissonance between where I need to be in this regard.
But well, I'll just say, I hope you're right, Justin.
Yeah.
I mean, like, I hope that's true. I will say that in the same way that people are very happy to make a bunch of Twitter bot accounts to make it seem as though there are a lot of voices saying something, I think people would be happy to make a bunch of fake videos to make it look as though there are many sources. But maybe I'm being overly skeptical. I sure hope that's the case, because, having an actually useful kind of evidence that we could use to answer these questions, I would be thrilled by. I'm just worried that given the incentive to manipulate in that way and the ability to manipulate in that way, that people will sure try to do it. And maybe they'll fail. Maybe we'll have sufficient, wherewithal to resist that kind of thing. But I just worry that we won't, I guess, is what I'll say.
Can I just say one more thing?
Oh yeah, go right ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, let me lower the hand again. My bad. I just wanted to say that, I totally agree with you, Justin, in public places where a lot of people are filming the same thing, like PR kind of statements or whatnot. But I'm more worried about more private things that could be staged and could where you only have like one possible camera source that could be kind of, how's the word, used to assassinate someone's character purposefully. That's what I'm more worried about. But okay, now I'm done. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks, Dylan. Deanna, and then I should go after this one.
I don't know.
Okay, my question was that why do we even care about who is right or wrong when it seems that there's echo chambers everywhere, and we kind of put ourselves in one, whether it's intentional or not. But I think that we should be more concerned with a balance of echo chambers and how I was thinking about like, how would we measure something like that? And I think that I don't remember her name, but spoke up earlier about power in India and how that resonates with so many different countries. And what are the ways that we can measure when there isn't a balance of chambers, right? So it would look like war, because all war is essentially is just a difference of ideas, of opinions. And so I think things like war, famine, poverty, those are all things that are markers for an unbalance of echo chambers. Just how we have a global north and we have a global south, there are things that are very different in both worlds. So I think that instead of asking like who's right or wrong, I think that we should be more concerned with like a balance of chambers.
Yeah, so I mean, that might be right. I have a hard time answering questions about why people should care about my philosophical projects. But I will say this thing that I said in response to the sort of skeptical solution here that we just can't know the answer. I think that there are at least some propositions where it's super important that we know whether they're true. Maybe for some things it's not super important, but for some things I think it is. And I think like who won the last presidential election is a proposition like that, because I think that knowing that proposition is a necessary condition for certain kinds of actions we should take. So I think living in a world where I just don't know who won the 2020 election is distressing. Like, because it's 2022 now, like we're almost out of 2022. And if I didn't know who won the election at this point, I'd be really worried. And I would be thinking, boy, we should be launching investigations and we should be like doing something about this. Because I think that being the president of the United States is a big deal and you shouldn't let somebody do it unless you know they won the relevant election. So I think the question of whether we know is important for taking certain kinds of actions. Now, it might be that trying to answer this question is not going to be as helpful as trying to answer a different kind of question, right? Like, even though it is important whether we know this proposition or not, it might be that our time would be better spent thinking about something else rather than this epistemic puzzle, like how do we get along with each other so that an imbalance in echo chambers or something else doesn't result in like outbreaks of violence. Maybe like, maybe not even maybe, you can certainly make the case that that is more important than my epistemic puzzle here. But unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, I'm not really qualified to answer the questions about how we like keep people from attacking each other. I'm not even sure I'm qualified to answer this question since I don't really have an answer. But I will just say that there is a reason to think that it is important how we should solve this puzzle, because each of us has to like make a choice about this. I mean, right now and continually every day. Like, you are probably in some echo chambers. What should you do about that? Maybe the answer is nothing. Maybe the answer is try to find an appropriate kind of balance with some people in another echo chamber. Maybe it's something else. But I think any of those is ultimately an answer to the question that I'm really interested in answering here, which is, my situation is I'm pretty sure I'm in an echo chamber. Now, what do I do about that? So I don't know if that perfectly answers your question, but that's some reason to kind of care about the project and some reason to think that we should at least worry about echo chambers to some degree. Again, I don't have anything like a good solution to this puzzle, but that's kind of what I'm worried about. I would say hopefully I've made you worried, but that's not actually what I hope. I hope that you all have a good solution to this and that you go and be rational in the world. And then when you find out how to do that, you just let me know, because I would like to be rational too. And I am not at all confident that I'm doing that right now.
That's good.
All right, I should go, but thank you very much for your questions and objections and various other interjections. It's always a good time to talk to Philosophy Club here. So thanks for having me, folks.
Thank you. Have a good one. Take care. Thanks for helping us learn stuff. And William, can I do the outro and then we cut the recording, and then we got a little bit of business to discuss after the recording. But can I do the outro?
Sure. One thing that I want to kind of bring in right before we head out is that well, Professor Carey and I certainly couldn't do any better at providing a solution to the problem. I will mention that we don't necessarily, especially in philosophy, maybe generally, have to answer the question we initially set out to answer in order to provide useful, beneficent conceptual tools. One of the important takeaways from, I think, that we can take away, as you will, from this discussion so far is that it may be tremendously important to have compassion for people who you think are caught in these echo chambers, because as we've explored, it's very difficult to tell. Even if you're in one, it's kind of difficult to tell, or it can be, and it's very difficult to see why you should leave, et cetera, et cetera. It's very easy to wind up in one for conditions that are not your fault. So that's one of the things I hope people will kind of take away, that we are dealing with a political situation where people are caught in these echo chambers. It's oftentimes not their fault, and so if there is a way to break those echo chambers, I tend to think that there is in practical cases. It will start out, I think, with a compassionate approach rather than a punitive one, where we just blame them for being in echo chambers and discard them. So yeah, please bear that in mind. And please, Dan, let's take the outro.
All right. Well, wanting to thank you to Dr. Carey for coming and talking about us and, keeping us informed and keeping our minds curious and everything. Thank you, fellow scholars, for being here, and fellow scholars for listening, whether you agreed or disagreed or somewhere in the middle, and, whatever else may be said about whatever else may be said, Until next time, finger guns. Cut, William. Cut.